Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Pete A. Turner, the host of the Break It Down show, and I thought I would check in a second or two here before Charles gets here. Charles is on the way, running a few minutes behind schedule, but I thought I would jump in just to say hi to you. I don't get enough time to interact with you all. If you want to write a comment in the comment section, I'll check them out and we can respond here. He should just be a few moments, but thought I would just update you on a couple things on the show. So I'm working on a thing called a record studio, and there's Charles right there, and we'll be doing biographical interviews for people. And hey, do you have headphones, Charles?
Yes. Let's see.
If you could.
All right.
Yes, I'll be doing biographical interviews for people in home. So if you guys are interested in this service at all, hit me up at peterbreakitdownshow.com. More to follow on that. Now that I have Charles here, we'll just get to work. Hey, Charles, can you hear me okay? But I don't hear you.
Okay.
Aha, there you are. Okay, great. Hey,
Can you hear
man.
me now?
Yeah, I do. Thanks for coming on the show.
Sure. It's been a hectic few days, which is I'm sort of wedging you in. Immediately after we speak, I jump in the plane and jump in the car and take my son to his summer job, and then I get on a plane. So
let's get to work then. Hey, one of the things I think a lot about, well, is here in California we have a lot of forestry and trees and like different landscapes and geography. And I think about reading your book, and I read 1491. Um, I don't know that we're doing a very good job of managing things. I was just reading your peer reviewed paper, and look, I'm not a climate denialist. I'm just a person trying to understand. So I read this paper, brand new peer reviewed paper, and yes, parts of the Antarctic shelf are melting away, but other parts are expanding. We don't know why. We don't know what to do about it. And there are so many of these things where, as we live on the earth and try to change things to our benefit, do we even know what we're doing, man? I mean, when you look at the pastoral Indians and how they manage things, how would you compare and contrast from your work how we manage the surface of the earth?
well, to how we manage them today compared to how it was done, 500 or 600 years ago here in North America, for example.
Sure, yeah.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I'm speaking to you from Massachusetts, and when I look out my window right now, there's a yellowish brown haze from some gigantic wildfires in eastern Canada, which is bringing to the East Coast what you guys on the West Coast have had for a number of years now. And so you say, well, ever happened before? And the answer is actually yes. Once in 1780, there was what there was called the Dark Day, in which in those days nobody knew why, but the entire East Coast was blanketed with smoke or this yellowish haze, and people thought it might be the end of the world. And the Connecticut state legislature wondered if they should adjourn if the apocalypse was going to happen. And there was prayer meetings and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it was actually only in I don't know 15 years ago that they figured out what it was. Cause was gigantic wildfires in eastern Canada. And so you can actually, between that point in 1780 and today, draw a little history. And the history is that up until the 1600s, Native people had been in charge of the forests. And as a guy named William Cronin wrote about really memorably in a book called Changes in the Land back in the 80s, the way they did it was by every fall and every spring doing these controlled burns, where it's kind of wet weather then, so the risk of forest fire is minimal, and you burn all the leaves and the accumulated fuels. It kills all the bugs, and it makes the forest wide open and park-like. And in fact, when John Smith, of Pocahontas fame, came to the eastern seaboard in the early 1600s, he said the trees were so widely spaced in the forest that you could gallop a horse through them. And he was so crazy he might have done that. Anyway, right through the middle of the forest. Anyway, those people mostly died because of enormous epidemics. There's a big epidemic in the 1630s of smallpox, and it just spread all the way all over the place. Those people stop managing the forest. Fuel builds up, and you start getting about 100 years, 150 years later, some enormous forest fires like they had in the 1780s. At that point, Europeans come in and they clear everything, for farmland. There's only, in Connecticut, there's supposedly only a quarter of an acre of, original copper forest left. This place was just completely, this beautiful New England countryside I'm in was completely devastated. Well, that stuff has started to grow back, particularly in the beginning of the 19th century. About 150 years later, we're starting to see fires again. So what that tells you is that we do other things with the forest and we make use of it. We sure don't prevent forest fires. And the reason is that we tend to either level it down, and clear cut it, or for timber, or we just kind of say, it's all wilderness and let it go. And Native people said, no, well, maybe there's this sort of in between thing you can do, which is to maintain it. And the people who lived on there for thousands of years got pretty good at it, kind of unsurprisingly. And so one of the things that I would argue that we should do is kind of pay attention to, how it was done back in the past. And that means a whole lot of small scale burning, particularly in the spring and fall. And it kind of means telling people who have second houses who in the middle of the woods, which in California where you are tends to be rich people, sorry, you're just going to have to take the risk. You guys built your house there, and it means putting it means a whole lot of legislation and allowing people to do this, which is effectively not possible right now.
You think about the Indian people hundreds of years ago, they didn't have helicopters, they didn't have flame retardant dust to drop on
Yeah,
fires. I mean, they didn't have all these modern tools. They didn't have fire jumpers. I don't even know if they had modern shovels, that made out of metal.
no,
But
no,
they, I mean, so nothing really put a fire out except for their ability to manage it, which is remarkable. I can't even
right.
comprehend
So nothing put it out except their ability to prevent it. And so, you got to be, if you lived in, Northern California, which is really fire prone, as we know now, and you didn't like having your house burned down all the time, you got to be pretty good at preventing it. And there's all these rules that if you talk to those guys, up in the, in the Klamath, which is in the far north of California, you talk to the Karuk or the Yurok or those guys who, that whole area has just been blasted by fires. And they say, well, no, you can do stuff. You do it in the wet season. Fire travels downhill, faster than goes uphill. I mean, faster goes the other way around. Sorry. So you
that.
light it here. You do it. You do it in the late afternoon when it's getting wetter. There's all these rules that they've learned from practical experience, and I kind of think that it should be done. Now, the curious thing is, it actually is being done in places that you don't hear about. Florida is pretty dry, right?
Right.
And all along the Panhandle and in southern Georgia, it's quite dry, and they have these longleaf pine forests, which go up like timber. Go up like tinder, excuse me. And but you don't hear about huge fires there, and the reason is that the landowners burn the land every year. They have a whole system of cooperative neighbors help each other, and there's funds that are set up if something goes wrong, which every now and then, because it's humans doing it, something goes wrong. You help out the guy who loses his barn or his fences or whatever, and it works fine. And California could learn something from those guys, and evidently so could we in New England. And they learned it from the Seminole,
Right. And that battle of conservation, preservation, and use, right? We're always trying to mix that around. And if
Yeah.
one of those legs in the stool gets a little too strong, then we end up with negative consequences. This is just
Right.
Pete's theory, but it seems that way to me. And at least here in California, and no knock on environmentalists, but you can't raise the elevation of a dam to house more water. You can't desalinate water. You can't because the environmentalists lock everything up in court, and that's how they fight these things. And so we fight progress, and we ultimately end up with a status quo, which is what nobody wants,
Right. But and it's also, that's absolutely true. And it's also true that the other side, it happens too. So, one of the things I'm working on a project here, and I spent some time up there, and and I would say to folks, well, everybody knows that you should do more preventive burning. And as you know, actually, under Gavin Newsom, preventive burning has gone down, which is crazy. He's really been out to, as far on this particular issue, he's really been out to lunch, as far as I can tell. I'm not from there, so maybe I got something wrong about that. But anyways,
No, yeah, I think you're right about that. Or maybe even if he wants to, he doesn't have the consensus,
Right. So you ask. So I asked this guy Frank Lake, who's a hoopa guy, and I said, and he's got a PhD in fire ecology. Okay, so he's got traditional teachings. He's got a PhD. He is the expert of experts. He wants to burn his land, and the regulations are he has to get a burn boss class 2 to supervise. Never mind that he teaches them. He has to get one to supervise. There's only 6 in the state of California. When I asked him a couple of years ago, you have to get. He wants to burn. It's like a half an acre. You have to get a giant tank of water, to put this out. And he's giving me all these bureaucratic regulations. I say, why do you have to do that? And he says, oh, it's all imposed by the guys of the second homes. They just want to make sure that it never happens because they don't want they don't want to come to their house on the weekend and see smoke around there. So, he says, when you finally do get it, they'll sue you under the Clean Air Act. So, it is absolutely true that there are environmental regulations that strangle everything, but these regulations have benefits to people you don't expect and are backed by people you don't expect.
There's a bunch of that clean air or coastline, all these different districts that, at least here in California, we've recognized because, like, hey, we need specific experts on the coast. And how big is the coast? Well, the coast goes back 100 yards or whatever that thing is. Yeah. And so if you want to change something, different permitting process, and that process, not a lot of people working a year. And so you want to put a project together and you're like, let's start. And if you dig, oh, that's bad because you started digging before you got a permit. You didn't get a permit for it. So like the amount of agencies it takes to deal with this and still can get thrown into court. I wanted to add one more thing too. I was watching the news, I don't know, a couple of years ago during one of our big fires here in California, and and these are lefty people, right? So these are not like Republican, Democrat. These are 2 people that are on the same side of the political spectrum and both experts. And one of them says, you have to burn the fallen trees because they create more fuel. And the other guy says, absolutely not. You have to leave them there because they're a fire break. And so you have these 2 guys who politically are aligned and academically disagree with how to manage a forest. So even then, it's like, what do you do? I mean, I just don't know how you.
It's absolutely true. And what somebody like Frank Lake would tell you is that sometimes you want fire breaks, if the trees are in the right place. But if they're not in the right place, they're just, because the fire break, you just can't be randomly placed. You put it where there's a chance that nature is helping you. If you put it at the top of the hill so it doesn't crest the hill, and that kind of stuff. So if it's just a dead tree, I think Frank said you burn it unless it's useful to you, and that requires human judgment. Right. And one of the things with regulations is they're designed to substitute for judgment, expert judgment. And unfortunately, I don't think that there is a substitute. People like Frank and these guys that I talk to, they know a lot. It's not like they're perfect, but they'll do better, I think, than these. And again, that stuff all the coast. Who lives on the coast in California? I'm going to guess it's not that many people with modest incomes.
Yeah. Well, and even like in like the smaller towns, still need a lot of money to live there. But like my father is from Capitola. Those folks don't want to change their community. They like how it is. It's been that way for a long time. It's their home. They don't want to change it. And we're always trying to fight with how do we modernize? How do we expand? How do we? And I don't know that we need to do either. But we have this fight that goes on and on and on. For sure, property values go up. But even just managing, like for example, Santa Cruz has a UC school in it, and it's 30,000 plus people there. And so you're like, does there need to be a 30,000 person school there, or have they reached their capacity for surviving on this little island of land at the base of this mountain in an earthquake zone on the edge of the ocean? I mean, should there even be? And we are bad at that part of it too, in managing how many people should be in an area. What's like, hey, this place for what we have right now, we can manage 80,000 people. And after that, we're going to have to squish it to the east and find other
Yeah.
accommodations.
And part of it is that places that would be naturally a place where you would think more people could be absorbed, like cities and so forth, typically have these neighborhood associations that are, as particularly in California, extremely good at making sure that that doesn't happen to preserve their way of life. And the problem is that there's all these sort of knock-on effects and unexpected things. So my town, I live in a kind of a bucolic, pretty New England town, which has a university beside it. A little bit like when you're talking about Santa Cruz, I was thinking of us in Amherst with the UMass. And UMass is a great institution. It takes working class kids and equips them with the tools to live good, get good jobs and get good lives. My wife teaches in the design and architecture department, and they get lots of kids who've been working construction and want to learn more so that they can be construction supervisors or managers or what have you, and they get good jobs, and it's really a great thing for them to be doing. We need new people who know how to do that stuff. We need electricians. We need all that, and UMass trains them. So that's a good thing, right? And but we have a town that, like every other town, doesn't want to change anything. So where are those students going to live? I mean, it's not wrong for them to want to go to school. and so what happens is there's not enough dorms, so they end up renting houses in the town. And there's people who come in and they say, wait a minute, we can make a whole boatload of money renting out this little house to 8 students. So they can pay much more money when the house goes on the market than an ordinary person who's just a family living there. And so half the town now is owned by these 2 giant mega developers who rent it out to students, and everybody's unhappy. And it's because we didn't recognize that that change is going to happen whether we like it or not.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know what to do about those things, because certainly the folks that pay the taxes there get to say, hey, we're a small community. We don't want big chain stores. We want the toniness of this bucolic town, the seaside town.
Right.
But
money talks.
And
so you're not, those are the same people who, you can get $50,000 more when you retire and sell your house and move to, a sunnier area from these property developers. And you're not going to tell grandma and grandpa not to get the best deal they can when they sell their house. And so little by little, the same people that have fought to make it bucolic are cashing out.
It's an interesting conundrum, and I guess this goes back to the original question: is there are so many variables with how we live our lives. We have a court system that protects people's rights, to this person's advantage, this person's disadvantage in every direction. Are we better at managing this super complex place than maybe the native people were in 1491 or 1320 and any years before that? Or is it unmanageable maybe?
Yeah. Well, people just aren't very good at governing themselves. I mean, I think that's pretty established. You can look all over the world and see really lousy governments. And it gets worse and worse the bigger and bigger things are. Now I got 8 billion people, and we got a country of, 350 million people, something like that, and almost 400. And it's, we're just not very good at doing that. Whereas, in 1400, there is 1,000 people in your band, and everybody knew everybody else, and they knew, don't vote for that guy. He's a drunk, right? And now who knows what's going on. So to me, I think the answer is in a certain sense, we're obviously worse at it, but that's because the problem is so much harder, and it's hitting us where we live because it's not something we're particularly good at as a species. I mean.
Yeah, and I as critical as, well, let's use my state again for as an example. Like, for all the folks who are unhappy with Governor Newsom, and he's been recalled, he's faced a recall election. I don't know that anybody can manage the state from Goose Lake to San Diego. That's one corner to the other. There's a lot of different things going on. LA County has snow in it and beach, and it's about 13,000 feet of elevation change. Or it's just, impossibly
Well,
diverse. How does
and it's the fifth largest economy in the world.
in the world?
Uh, in the world, if it was a
Yeah.
separate country, it would be, up there with Japan and stuff. It's like a serious enterprise. California is, and it's really, hard to manage it. That said, um, there's some issues in California and in other places that require people, and I would put most of the politicians. I mean, politicians are good, are typically good at their job because they like talking and dickering with people, and they have good people sense. In different ways. Trump
Mhm.
obviously, has a really clear idea of who he can, how he can maneuver around people, and Biden clearly has that same thing. They're obviously very different in other ways. But one of the things that they're not good at is sort of dealing with the non-human world. And as we get to environmental problems, you find people paying kind of lip service to them, or not really being able to wrap their heads around them and making kind of silly policies. And I think there's just a mismatch between the type of people who rise to the top in a democratic system and things like you have in California, where you really have to prioritize the fact that you've maintained the forest badly for 100 years. The federal government, state government, local government, everybody's to blame, and you're just going to have to spend a boatload of money and a boatload of thought on something that nobody's going to be very happy with you for doing. Because
Yeah.
you spend all this money, and if you're lucky, nothing happens, right? There's no fires. People forget about it, and then they say, "You spent all this money. Why are you doing this? Why is all this happening?" Right?
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
and
about
it's
this. Yeah, go
really
ahead.
unrewarding. If you're a politician, that's really unrewarding.
Yeah.
It's not like you get to build a bridge and there's, the Pete Turner Bridge. You're never going to see the Pete Turner unburned forest.
Right. You're right though. Like we, as a body, in general, all of us humans, we don't like to have change. We don't want to lose what we have. We fear
Yeah,
that changes in that direction. One of the things in the Bay Area where I'm ultimately from, but I live down south now. But we have a thing called PG&E. It manages our gas and electric service, and they get blamed for fires, probably rightfully so. However, to send two dudes in a bucket truck 500 miles up from the middle of anywhere to go maintain lines is enormously expensive and dangerous to these guys that got to go 50 feet in the
yeah,
air, and they're driving over dry grass. They're like, oh, but we have to weed abate this grass first. Who does this grass belong to? I mean, all these questions, and it becomes this giant, immovable, unsolvable problem where if you dare to say, hey, Bay Area, we're going to turn the power off completely for 4 days and reset everything and make massive improvements, people lose their minds. They're like,
right.
absolutely not, and don't raise my rates.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And it's the same thing. Maintenance, which is what we're talking about, really.
right.
That we have to maintain these systems, both natural and human, is something that we have not. There's historically been a lot of problems with that, getting
Mm,
hard to get. And the way that Native people did it, in often cases, was by making it part of their religion. You that taking care of the environment around you was part of what you did when you went to church, so to speak. And you sort of from a secular sort of viewpoint, you laugh at this, but then you think like, well, they did pretty well for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This system, we don't have that system. It's not just us. There's just last week, I believe, there was this gigantic train crash in India,
mm,
and why? And there is just a big study and said, why did that happen? And it happened because India, all the politicians and everybody liked building new trains and having fancy new trains. They didn't prioritize maintaining the boring job of maintaining the old tracks. And this is the same kind of thing. The crashes that didn't happen, nobody gets a medal for it.
yeah. Yeah. Nobody gets a medal for those things. Let's change gears a little bit, and let's look at. So I've been fascinated by these recent peer-reviewed articles that have come out of the Rising Star Cave system, and how we're looking at the people. And I don't know how much you know about this, but there's this burial ground that they've been studying for almost 10 years now, and it shouldn't be there. It's people we don't know about. So basically, we're discovering a completely new civilization with not even humanoid, but like these are proto-humans, smaller, like grapefruit-sized brains. If you guys
Yeah.
don't know about this, it's
Yeah.
fascinating. And so, look, you and I, we could talk about all these things all the time, but we don't know anything about our history. Like when you look at the amount of the Earth that's been covered archaeologically, and all you got to do, it seems like, is dig a little deeper, and all of a sudden you find someone's lunch sack that shouldn't be there from 250,000 years ago. What are your thoughts when we get like something like Rising Star, and how many more rising stars could there be in underwater archaeology? There's so much to study that we don't have the bandwidth, the attention span, or the money to do.
Well, I think it's tremendously exciting. You know, 20 years ago, we thought we knew what human origins were. You know, it was pretty straightforward, out of Africa, and people spread, and so forth. Now there's all these different species of hominins. You know, there's the Homo naledi, which is the one you were just talking about. There's there's the Denisovans. And it turns out they interbred, so that we, different of us have different amounts of these folks' genes in us. Apparently, it just means that our history is just way more complex and rich than we thought. And I'm interested in this stuff, and I just think we're living in a golden era, which people are learning. It seems like practically every year there's a discovery where somebody goes, "Oh, that's not possible." Year before this, it was these very, very old evidence of human beings in West Africa, far from where we had imagined that there was, because there's always thought to be in East Africa. Africa is huge, so this is a long way away from where they're supposed to be. Then, of course, all these different types of human. So right now, it's a state of what I think of. My father-in-law is a scientist, and he talked about when things are in a state of glorious confusion. That means you really have no idea what's going on, and if you're a scientist, that's really exciting.
I live under
puzzle.
it's such and it's at least a 200 to 250,000-year-old puzzle, if not half a million years back, because every time we think we're far enough back, we find out that not only does it go further back, but there's a lot different things. You talked about like the interbreeding between Denisovans, and the amount of Denisovan DNA that's in the Brazil, in the basin there. Like, how did that get there? So I work under the assumption that there's always, as long as there's been humans or humanoids, there have been people in North America, South America. They've just been here, because if you break it with your girlfriend, you're like, I'm gonna jump on this log and it's gonna sail me somewhere. If you have enough provisions, you'll make that trip, and next thing you know, there's 25 dudes there, and it's always been humans everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, I guess the question is, it seems very likely to me that people went across the Atlantic, or excuse me, the Pacific way earlier than we suspect. But the question is whether they made it or not, because just as many of those dudes go on the logs, and it doesn't turn out well. So when was it consequential? And I think that's when, and we know that it's quite possible it was in the 19th century. Half a dozen Japanese fishermen, in their relatively simple vessels, blew across the North Pacific and ended up in Washington and British Columbia. And obviously, those vessels were more sophisticated than the ones 10,000 years ago. But it stands to reason that at least some people made it across that way. But when were there enough people that you could actually get something going, and they weren't like Robinson Crusoe wandering around? And because the United States is really big, guys came across separately. What are the odds that they're going to run into each other? Not so much. So consequentially, I think the earliest really strong evidence we have that there's definitely a group of people living, and shaping the environment, and is 16, 17,000 years. What are the odds that those are the very first? Not good. So I think most archaeologists would say, this kind of thing I'm talking about, consequential, 20,000 years ago. There's lots of possible evidence of much earlier events. There's a cave in Mexico that where they seem to have tools that they think they're tools that are 33,000, I think it is, years old. But the problem is when you have very, very simple tools, which is what you're dealing with when you're talking about food, it's really hard to tell those apart from naturally fragmented rock because people use the tools out of rock that naturally fragments in a good way and produces sharp edges and that sort of stuff. And so it's really hard to tell whether somebody hammered it to produce that sharp edge or another rock fell on a rock, because what did they hammer it with? A rock. And so it's very, very difficult to tell from just tools and stuff. And so the evidence for the earlier stuff is shaky, kind of as you would expect it to be.
Tom DeMarais out here in San Diego at the Nat, he has that find. I think it's 100,000 years old where they've got, I don't know, mastodon carving marks on the bone, and it's
Right.
like this, like, is it significant?
Right.
I mean, it is, but is
Right.
it? I don't know.
Yeah. And again, with mastodons, there's always going to be a certain number of mastodons that, die at the bottom of the hill and a bunch of rocks fall on them. And it's really hard to tell, rocks that have been where somebody's just whacking it to get the marrow out versus, a whole bunch of rocks falling on it naturally, because in both cases, you're dealing with rock smashing bones. Not in any way to diss the guy. It's just a very, very tough problem. And so the ideal thing would be to find different kinds of evidence. The tools is just really tricky, like skeletons. If you found a skeleton and radiocarbon dated it to 100,000 years ago, question's over.
Right. The one of the things too is this is found, I believe, in the construction of a highway. And so you think, well, let's just go dig a little deeper around this highway. Maybe there's something there in that region or whatever. But you're just literally guessing as to what you're going to find. And so maybe a mile and a half from that elephant being dead, there is a camp that you could find. But you don't know until you get out there with your paintbrush and start slowly taking away at 40 feet deep or however deep they were. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, how realistic is it to find these things, or is it always going to just be an accident? And is it going to be under the, whatever hospital? Like, oh my God, it's the greatest find ever. We dug a little deeper for a new portion of the basement to put in a sump pump, and turns out we've discovered this whole new world.
Well, that's going to clearly always happen. And what archaeologists do is they try to, if you like, imagine themselves in that world 50,000 years ago or 70,000 years ago and say, where would be a good place for me to set up camp? And, so some locations are going to be more likely than others. And you can read it. And that's how I believe that Tom Dillahay and his crew found the sites in the very southern part of Chile that seem to be so old, is that where is a good place for people to hang out? And they throw it down quite a bit. But what can you say? The world is very large. There's a lot of places that people might want to live. I'm sorry. For some reason,
I had muted myself. I was going to say, here in the Western states, a lot of the places where we live now were underwater for a long time too. And so, is that the right place to look, or is the place to look what's underwater now, because the Earth is constantly terraforming itself?
Yeah, and then that's one of the things if you're looking for very stuff that's during the Ice Age, the oceans dropped. There's all this ice that was piled up on these giant glaciers, and the water from that came from the oceans, and the ocean sea level dropped by in some places 300 feet, and then when the ice melted, they filled up. But if you wanted to live on the coastline and get the fish and the shellfish and all the coastal resources, kelp in particular, you would live as close to the shore as you could, and that means that where you lived was now be 300 feet deep. And underwater archaeology, while it exists, is something that's really quite difficult to practice.
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting to you? I mean, you've been answering my questions about, forest management and that kind of thing, but what are you fascinated by right now?
Well, I'm writing a book about the North American West, so I'm pretty fascinated by what's going on in the West. I am, let's see, I guess right now I've been reading about the Pueblo Revolt. Do you know what that is?
No, huh?
Okay. Well, the Spaniards came up to, the Pueblo in the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, and then people, living to the west of that. Um, in 1590. The big expedition was in 1598, and they set up shop there. And it was pretty much a thoroughgoing disaster because the whole idea was they might find gold and silver, and they didn't. So the only resource there was the Pueblo themselves, which the missionaries thought as a resource of souls to save, and the Spanish governors and so forth thought of as people they could enslave and sell to the silver mines in what is now northern Mexico. And this didn't go over well. And one of the problems for the Pueblo is that they were really these sort of fiercely independent people. Each Pueblo is like its own little nation. And Pueblos, would be aggregates of two or three communities that, jealously guarded their independence. So none of them individually were strong enough to beat the Spaniards. Collectively, they could, but that would require allying in a way that they didn't usually do, and also having a unified military command, which was something, of course, giving up your independence. So it took them quite some time to do it. But when they did do it, they kicked the Spaniards out, and that kind of broke the back. Spaniards came back and sort of nominally, quote unquote, reconquered it, but that was pretty much it for the Spanish Empire. And the Pueblo called this the first American Revolution. Think about it. They're rebelling against the king across the ocean who's taxing them unfairly and forcing them to host armies that they don't want to do. The least of grievances is pretty similar. And so I've been really intrigued by learning more about this. And it was successful. That was the thing.
Yeah, that's always the thing, right? If it's not successful, I always talk about like the discoverers who went out and got assassinated by the people they met with. We don't write their history book; they just get thrown into the I did a show with Andreas Resendes, and he wrote a book.
He's wonderful. Yes, yes, he's a terrific historian. He's and a good guy.
Yeah, and I love his book about Cabeza de Vaca. And all the resources we have. It's incredible, that journey. And by the way, I wanted to say this because this is important, because we don't have a connection like this. There's no way that Cabeza de Vaca didn't fear God. He knew that God existed, because how else could he explain everything that happened in his life? If we reanimated him right now and said, hey, there's not really a God, he would be beyond gobsmacked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, and one of the things important when we were talking about the Pueblo and the Spaniards, Spaniards are deeply religious, and they looked out, and when, if there's a flood, God caused it. If there was a disease, God caused it. If there was lightning, God caused it. The Pueblo looked out, and if there was a flood, their gods caused it. If there was a disease, their gods caused it. If there was lightning, their gods caused it. They both, believed that there was a supernatural world that was just constantly intervening in a daily. And part of your job as a person, was to get into a good relationship with these supernatural powers. And you did it in different ways. The Spaniards, you went to church and you prayed to the idols. You pray. You talked about the saints. You had relics of the saints. They both had really sacred objects that you were very involved with. And the Pueblo were the same. They're both, in certain ways, more similar to each other than either was to us. And so when the missionaries came, it wasn't like when, from time to time a Seventh-day Adventist or a Mormon or something comes to my door, and I pretty much instantly know what my reaction is, because I know who they are and know this. When those guys came, there's this alternative spiritual system, and who knows, maybe I should listen.
Yeah.
So it was quite different.
And it depended on, you're saying this, and I want to expand this. The religion that shows up to your door, are they Catholics? Are they something else? Does that make you a human, a subhuman when you're interacting with that native person? And all of these things are so beyond anybody's control when you encounter them. We put a lot of moral responsibility on an explorer that shows up somewhere, Columbus, everything else. But if we were in Columbus's time, we would do the exact same thing. These guys are all doing what they think is right. And are they profiteering? We profiteer all the time now. We come on. It's like we have all these norms, but really humans do what humans do. And what humans do is exactly what happened during that age of discovery.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the time of Columbus, slavery was widespread throughout the world. In different amounts in different places. England didn't have as much because England was as close to at the time of Columbus, as close to an anti-slavery place as you get. But that wasn't because they were saints or something. It was because England was actually far from the place where we could get slaves, which is North Africa and Eastern Europe. And its ships were constantly being picked up by, the Barbary slavers, if you remember the Barbary pirates.
Yeah.
And so there are thousands and thousands of English people who were enslaved. And so their benefit cost ratio from slavery was worse than everybody else. So naturally they didn't like it. There's more anti-slavery centers, but Spain was in a good position. And so it, 10% of the population at the time of Columbus, 10% of the population of Seville was enslaved. So it's a big presence. They go to the Americas and they want to do all this stuff. They want to mine silver, they want to mine gold, they want to have ranches and so forth. Well, where's the labor going to come from? Spaniards go there to get rich. They didn't go to work in the mines. They go there to own the mines, right? So where's the people going to come from? Well, you're going to ask native people to do it. Why would they do it? Right? Right. That's unpleasant work and you don't benefit. Why would I work for you to doing this? I don't want to do that. And so, the whole logic is eventually that if you're going to do all these things the Spaniards want to do, you're going to start enslaving them. And that was the logic. And nobody said, very few people said it was bad. Now, to be fair, the premier human rights activist of the time was a Spanish guy, Las Casas, Bartolome de las Casas, a repentant conquistador turned monk who, spent decades and decades very successfully fighting slavery. So, it wasn't completely, thoughtless. So, but the point is that all of this follows from the logic. And so we can look at it and say, this was terrible. And we were right, but we also can't say it was surprising.
Right. Yeah. And what else could have happened? You get a captain.
I mean, they could have. Yeah. They could have said what La Casa said, which is, okay, if you're going to do this, pay them.
Yeah.
Really pay them. But
yeah.
But people who are the big bosses were just as happy about paying laborers then as they are now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing that we lose track of is how incredibly dangerous and unlikely your survival is if you go from Europe to the New World to make your fortune happen. It's not a gentle thing for anybody to go over an ocean to an unknown land and then try to walk back 10 years later with your pockets stuffed full of cash and keep your head on yourself. It's just not likely.
No. And yeah, exactly. And rough customers are more likely to be successful in this, partly because the native people are just sort of an ordinary spread of people, and somebody bulldozes their way in. People don't know how to react when that happens because it's so out of their experience.
Yeah.
And so somebody like Cortez comes, and the people that he encountered, the Maya and so forth, just had, what is this? What does he want? And it helped. Gold and silver weren't particularly valuable to them. They were just, pretty, and they liked them for their colors. But their currency was something else. It was cacao beans and salt and things like that were used for their medium of exchange. And so, it's kind of like somebody bulldozes into your house or your community and demands all your Christmas tree ornaments and says, "I'll kill you if you don't." It's just, what is going on, right? And surprise, it was a very powerful weapon for the conquistadors. They're going to kill people over this?
Well, and then you think about what the conquistadors experience when they do see, Montezuma and the practices that are going on there. That has to also equally shock the hell out of them. And like, you're
But
doing
it's
what?
funny. Yeah. No, but it is funny also
Yeah.
because back then in Europe, I mean, the criminal justice was pretty rough. And so that was a form of entertainment, was public hangings.
Mm.
And the state would come out, and they bring in all the prisoners, and they would do things like, England was the most bloodthirsty probably of all, even more than Spain. They would rip them apart, they would hang them, they would, they would draw and quarter them, they would do all this stuff. Meanwhile, the priests would be saying incantations about how this was all, because they had committed crimes against the king, who is the representative of God, and so in a certain way, they were very familiar with these sort of large-scale public executions. There's this 17th century English writer named Samuel Pepys, which is weird. It's spelled P-E-P-Y-S, but it's called Pepys. I guess that was how you pronounce his name. And he wrote this famous diary, and he would talk about how we went to Tyburn Square in London, and there was a crowd of 10,000 people to watch the executions. And they're all, yelling and screaming and having a great time. So when the Spaniards they're shocked by what they're seeing, but it's also a little stylized, it's a little bit of like, oh, these guys are really bad, so it's okay for us to conquer them, because the Spanish, whether this is righteous, because unlike the Jews, who they can feel safe in hating, they haven't, quote, rejected Christ, because the people in the Americas never heard of him. Pope says, that it's okay to conquer the sinful, Muslims and Jews. It's not me endorsing this. This is just, the logic of the time. But these guys over in the Americas have not rejected Christ. And so they say, you can actually do this colonial thing, but only if you use it to convert the natives. And, the profit you make is worth it if you do this. And so they had this sort of gloss of religion over it. But of course, the actual people on the ground who are doing this are about as interested in converting the natives as you would expect an entrepreneur would be. It's like, okay, this is this thing we got to do. It's the regulatory morass of the times, is that you have to show this effort you've done.
I'm also fascinated by the individual stories. Like, you put that mission on the ground, and Oriana is like, I'm on the other side of the Andes. What am I going to do? Right. And then you have this whole different thing that happens. And then there's the legal battle. Cabeza de Vaca has to write these impeccable journals so he can stay alive if he ever gets home. He's like, I'm not going to claim any miracles because that will get me killed. And so they're all very careful with how they treat, what happens when they get home.
Yeah, well, that's what their goal is eventually, to be returned, in grandeur. Now their kids who are born over there maybe less so, but what Cortez wanted, he was this sort of from the minor nobility. He wanted to be climb the social ladder and be a rich and powerful guy with a title and a coat of arms and the whole bit, and to return in triumph to Spain. And this was the great thing the king always had on them, is that they had to get all those things, and to fit into Spanish fabric, they had to make the king happy with them. And of course, their vainglorious urges led them to, essentially, from the king's point of view, establish their own country, which he didn't like. So he's constantly reining them in. But that was the motivation, and it's not that different from many people from too many people today. Right, wanting to have the social approval of people you care about.
I don't want to spoil the new book, but do you want to talk about the Northwest and what you've discovered so far?
Sure. It's just really the idea of the book is this, and I'll just this is sort of like an elevator pitch. Is my son started going to school, and he took American history, and I was looking at his American history textbook, this big fat thing, and I'm from the West. And, even though I live out here in the East and have lived out here for decades, if you woke me up in the middle of the night and said, "Where are you from?" I would say, you put a gun to your head, "Tell me where you're from." I would say the West, even though it's an illusion. And my kids like it out there, and we travel and visit my parents and relatives and friends. So they talked about moving there. So I've been thinking about this and thinking about what kind of West, if they moved in there and they're got to be my age in 2050 or 2060, what kind of place would we live in? And what do we know about it? And obviously can't predict the future, but some things would be surprising if they didn't happen. And one thing is pretty clearly going to be hotter and drier than it is now. That would be a big if it was. And one of the things that you get from his history textbook is pretty much this idea. I forgot to say this, so I'm going to back up. What's in his textbook is pretty much what the idea of the frontier. That there's this movement from east to west. On this side is civilization, on this side is savagery. They have a nicer name for it, but that's what they mean. And they move over and they tame nature, and the Indians disappear, and the West kind of disappears as a separate entity. And that's what Frederick Jackson Turner, this famous American historian, wrote about in the 1890s, which kind of created the genre of the Western movie and the Western idea of the rugged individualist. All that came from the idea of the frontier. But if you look at 2050, the idea that nature is tame is going to seem pretty silly. I mean, it seems very silly now. The idea that in the West, which is going to be something on the order of 40% Hispanic, people from the South, and another 10% people from the Pacific. The idea that what's really important is this movement of people from the East who look like me, not so strong. And then the idea that Native people disappeared, that really seems off. And in fact, one of the things that in my lifetime, growing up there, is the gradual regaining of sovereignty by Native people. And so conventional histories that begin in 1800 with Lewis and Clark just don't seem right, when it's actually more like what the future is going to be more like 1200, when there was huge droughts, huge wildfires, a crazy mixed up jumble of people and multiple overlapping polities. And so I'm writing a history of that West. The West is going to be like what we are now, and hopefully more useful than the one that my son learned about at school.
Yeah. Well, and when do you expect to have that done, or do you have any idea?
I'm hoping to finish this summer.
Okay, good.
I should say that I have to leave in just a couple of minutes. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, I'm taking my son to he's moving to Boston, the Boston area for his summer job. And the car is actually, as I'm speaking to you, the car is actually outside filled with his stuff. And my wife and are standing, outside here tapping their foot.
Let's get them to stop tapping. Thank you so much. This has been so great. I'd love to have you come back on when you've got the book ready to go.
My pleasure. I'm sorry to be the guy pulling the plug, but believe me, it's survival on my end.
Yeah, I understand. Let's keep everybody happy on your end. I'm going to run the credits. You get out of here. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you